I'm Graham Hodges from the Department of History, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this year's W.B. Du Bois lecture featuring Lawrence Hill, the author. Before I introduce him, let me acknowledge the support primarily of Africana and Latin American Studies, the principal sponsor of this event, but also the Department of Education, Film and Media Studies, and the Division of University Studies. This year's speaker, Lawrence Hill, follows in the honorable tradition of Du Bois, I think in many, many ways. Like the master, Hill is a prolific author of many nonfiction books and novels. Du Bois, after all, wrote several. Both are deeply concerned with issues of race in their time and of the color line. And in his 10 books and in his myriad philanthropies, which you might want to ask him about later on, Lawrence Hill also mirrors Du Bois in his unstinting search for social justice in America and in Canada. This theme is very apparent in his books and in his life. Lawrence Hill wrote the nonfiction book Blood, the Stuff of Life, which formed the basis for his 2013 lectures at the University of Toronto. And Dear Sir, I intend to burn your book, The Anatomy of a Book Burning. The title, I think, explains quite a bit. His earlier books include, though certainly not all of them, Blackberry, Sweet of the Juice on Being Black and White in Canada, The Deserter's Tale, An Ordinary Soldier Who Walked Away from the Iraq War, published in 2007, about U.S. Army Private Joshua Key, who sought refugee status in Canada after going without leave from the American troops, trying to follow in the steps of similar people who had done that during the Vietnam War. The theme of social justice is also very apparent in Lawrence Hill's last 2 books, the Book of Negros, a book that traces the lives of black loyalists and self-emancipated people who sided with the British military during the American Revolution. That book was a major seller in Canada and in many parts of the world. It's been translated into many languages and is highly regarded in the United States. It won the Commonwealth Prize in 2008 for that. It was one of the top prizes in the world. Later, it was reprinted as an illustrated book, which you see the cover of up here, and then made into a mini-series and shown on BET in the United States in Canada this last year. His newest book, The Illegal, concerns an athlete who takes refuge in a hostile country and experiences statelessness, an increasingly common situation for refugees and oppression in our time. And today, Mr. Hill will present some material about showing the Black American Revolution through fiction. Please welcome Lawrence Hill.
I've got a mic here, so I don't need that one. You can just put it down if you want. Good. Just set it down. Thank you so much, Professor Hodges, and thank you very much to Colgate University for welcoming me back. This is actually my 3rd visit to Colgate. I believe I came shortly before the Book of Negros was published, so that would have been about 9 or so years ago, and was back again for Summer Institute a few years ago, and so here I am for my 3rd visit. Great to be back, and I hope there are more visits to follow. I'm the product of American immigrants who left D.C. the day after they married interracially in 1953 and moved to Toronto, Canada, never to go back to live again in the United States. And as you may imagine, the last thing that immigrants to Canada are looking for, and certainly the last thing that most middle-class Canadians are looking for, is to see their sons and daughters become novelists. They're looking for doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, and anything that they think can sort of protect their children from the economic, social, and racial vicissitudes that they've faced in the countries that they fled. And so my father wasn't all too pleased to see my brother turn into a singer-songwriter or me turn into a novelist. But I think it's very common for the children of immigrants and for the children of those who made it into the middle classes to look to the arts. And I think it's also very difficult for children of immigrants and children of, certainly of African Canadian families and children of middle class families to stand up to their parents and say, no, I'm not going to law school, I'm not interested in medical school, I want to be a painter, or I want to be a saxophonist, or I want to, in my case, be a novelist. It's a difficult thing to do, but when it's in your blood, you've got to do it. And you ignore your passions at your own risk. And I know that life looks a whole lot more interesting waking up at 16, 26, 36, 56, when you're waking up with passion and something you're just burning to do, something that lifts you up and moves you every day. So I'm quite honored to be a novelist. And I've ventured occasionally in my novels and in my nonfiction into history. I'm not a historian, actually, but I've become an avid amateur historian by dint of becoming a novelist. And actually, to be honest, as a child, I thought that the study of history constituted a violation of my constitutional rights. I thought it was so boring and awful that I didn't want to study history in high school or in university. And that's because my teachers really didn't do a good job when I was a child of showing me the breadth, the life, the drama, the struggle in history. I had to start reading novels as an adolescent to discover how interesting I found history. It was fiction that led me into an admiration and a thirst, an obsessive desire to learn more about history. And I think that's true of many people, Canadians and Americans, who find that the arts might trigger a passion of theirs, and they may start digging and learning more about history as they go, initially stimulated by an interaction with the arts. Film, music, literature can have ways of capturing the popular imagination. Some historians look down on novelists who dabble in history and think that they're sort of second-rate historians. But I'm proud, actually, to popularize history and to move into realms that excite readers who might not come to it in a history textbook. So in the most recent book that I've just published, which comes out in the States in January, but came out in Canada in September, I've examined the life of a so-called illegal refugee, a refugee who's hiding in an undocumented manner in a country where he's not wanted. He was an elite marathoner in his home country. He's had to flee it to escape rising ethnic genocide. So he goes to a country, a rich, developed nation where he's not wanted and where he's hiding and where his pursuit can no longer be Olympic glory, as he's had to flee genocide, but staying alive and using his marathoning legs, using his capabilities as an elite runner, not to look for Olympic glory, but to stay alive, to flee capture, to flee deportation. An interesting way to meditate on running. But that's a novel set in 2018 in a mild dystopia. But today, it's called The Illegal. But today I'm going to talk to you about the Book of Negros, which was published in 2007, initially, and then this illustrated edition came out, and earlier this year, and as Professor Hodges mentioned, in the States and in Canada and in a few other countries, it was aired as a 6-part television miniseries, which I had a hand in writing and bringing to the fore. That was quite exciting. Well, there are so many aspects of African Canadian and African American history that are underlooked and unknown in the United States and in Canada. And I think one of the most underregarded, underappreciated, unknown aspects of the story of blacks in both countries and the migration that they experienced between the two affects the story of the black loyalists. Who were these loyalists and how did they give rise to this novel of mine, The Book of Negros? Well, really, to explain that, I think I'll go to the heart of the title, which has been so controversial around the world and was even so here in the States. What is the Book of Negros? Well, the Book of Negros is a document. It's a historical ledger that was kept by the British Navy in 1783 to document the exodus of 3,000 blacks who were leaving Manhattan and going to Nova Scotia, Canada, mostly. A few were going to Germany, a couple others to England, 1 or 2 to Quebec City, a handful to Caribbean nations, but the overwhelming majority, more than 90% of the 3,000 black loyalists fleeing Manhattan at the end of the American Revolution are sailing to Nova Scotia, which is about to become Canada. It's still a British colony, and they're sailing there to assert their freedom and to escape re-enslavement. Well, how did they get to New York City? Well, during the American Revolution, the British tried everything they could to quash this revolution. One of their tricks was to offer freedom in writing, issued by the most senior British military commanders to any African American who would profit from the chaos of revolution, come behind British military lines in New York being the bastion of British military and naval power during the war. New York is the one city that the British inhabit for all but 6 months of the 8-year Revolutionary War. So it's to Manhattan that these African Americans flee to cash in on this promise of freedom. They promise freedom in writing to African Americans who will come serve them, who will flee their plantations, profit from chaos of war, leave slavery behind, and serve them in the war. So they do come by the thousands, and they settle in the southern tip of Manhattan, where they serve the British as soldiers, spies, cooks, road builders, prostitutes, midwives, you name it, they do it. Men and women with their children in tow come by the thousands to settle in the southern tip of Manhattan. And of course, it's important to visualize Manhattan as an island, and you don't get on or off Manhattan during this Revolutionary War without the sanction of the British Navy, which is all powerful as a naval force. And so it's to Manhattan that these blacks come, many living in a community that you can only find little notes about in historical texts called Canvas Town, so named for the discarded sails from sailing ships that are in the Hudson River, and those discarded sails become the stuff of tents that blacks and others erect in the southern tip of Manhattan to live and to survive in the New York winters. Canvas Town is where many of these blacks live, serving the British in desperate hope of being liberated when the war ends, which is what the British promised. So my character, who's born in West Africa in a country now known as Mali, is abducted. She is about 11 when she's abducted, just entering puberty, brought into chains into the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where she works in an indigo plantation. Eventually, it comes up to New York City, where she flees her so-called owner and goes into hiding as the Revolutionary War breaks out. She and thousands of others serve the British in the war, but when the war ends, the British lose. So what's to happen to these 3,000 African Americans who've served the British on the promise of freedom? And it's a very interesting notion, these blacks serving the British in the war. You pretty well can't grow up in the United States, or even as I did in Canada with American parents, and not know that the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War was a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks serving the rebels. This is part of American lore. But who in America goes to school and learns about the black loyalists who served the losers in the American War, who served the British? It's a pretty well unknown story, except to scholars, wonderful people such as Professor Hodges, who introduced me, among other writers, to this story as I was reading his works and works by his contemporaries when I was researching this novel. That's, by the way, how we first got to meet. I contacted Professor Hodges to ask him a few questions about one of his books about the black loyalists as I was researching this novel. So who's heard about that story? The story of the losers tends to get swept under the rug and forgotten. And this is the story, after all, of thousands of blacks who served the British because they believed that the British were most likely to liberate them after the war. And I like to imagine the mindset of an African-American slave at the outbreak of the Revolution. A quick-thinking person is going to ask himself or herself, who's most likely to serve my interests? Who's going to liberate me? These white people fighting each other, which side is likely to liberate me from the chains of slavery? So several thousand chose to serve the British. So they come to New York. But the war ends. And in the peace treaty, although the British have promised in writing freedom to these blacks who've served them in the war, in the peace treaty they promised not to make off with, not to abscond with, not to take away any Negroes or other property belonging to the rebels who have won the war. So they appear in the peace treaty to betray the very blacks that they promised to liberate, this treaty being signed in Paris. As it turns out, the British begin evacuating those who've served them for at least a year behind British military lines. Anyway, despite what the peace treaty says, much to the rage of George Washington, who complains to the British commander-in-chief, Sir Guy Carleton, that these blacks should not be carted off because they belong to the American rebels. And Carleton responds that because they've served the British for at least a year, they're no longer in the eyes of the British American slaves, they're no longer in the eyes of the British property of the rebels. They've earned their freedom through 1 year's service or more to the British during the war, so they are going to be taken away. So they were taken by ships in the Hudson River. It's about a 9-day trip from New York, from Manhattan to Nova Scotia. And although people of African origins have been in Canada since about 1603, 1605, and although slavery in Canada dates back just as far as it does in the United States, the first massive migration of black people into Canada comes in 1783 with this departure of 3,000 African Americans in the last half of 1783, sailing from New York to Nova Scotia. The first documented slave in Canada goes back to 1628, a young boy named Olivier Lejeune, who's a slave of a number of people in Quebec City, and he's apparently from Madagascar, although most people are known to have been abducted from West Africa. He's from Madagascar, and he's our first documented slave in Canada, 1628. There are other documented instances of slavery existing and finally being abolished in the British Empire, including Canada, in 1834. But it never sort of amounts to the same massive economic power, the same economic influence in the States that it does in Canada. We don't have the weather, we don't have the climate to allow for plantation economies. So slavery in Canada is predominantly an urban rather than a rural or a plantation phenomenon. But these 3,000 African Americans who are about to become African Canadians constitute the first massive wave of black people into Canada, and they come to Nova Scotia. And actually, Nova Scotia is the only Canadian province that has isolated, geographically distinct black communities. For the most part, the black population in Canada has lived within and sprinkled among white and other communities. There have not been, for the most part, geographically distinct, enduringly all black communities in Canada, with the exception of Nova Scotia, where there are many geographically distinct black communities that continue to this day. Geographically distinct, initially segregated black churches, black social gatherings, black towns, villages. And they continue to this day. So it's a very unique province in the sort of Canadian demography and the Canadian history, and it has a very unique link to the United States because of this migration. After 10 or so years in Canada, of course, not only were they promised freedom for serving the British during the war, but they were also promised land and tools to break the land and provisions to live off until they could break the land once they arrived in Nova Scotia. But although the British liberated and you could say saved these African Americans in New York City, drew them out of New York before they could be re-enslaved and punished or perhaps killed for what they'd done during the war, punished by their former owners who were looking to take them back. They were saved by the British in New York, but they were betrayed by the same British in Canada. They endured a pretty homicidal neglect in Nova Scotia. They were not fed, they were not given land, they were not given tools to break the land for the most part. They were allowed to freeze and starve to death, through the Nova Scotian winters. Slavery continued to be perpetuated in Canada after they arrived. So some were enslaved in Canada. Others were kept in indentured servitude, which was as dangerous to their survival as slavery. And profoundly, most importantly, they were kept, for the most part, landless in Canada. They were not given the land that they were promised or the tools to break it. And so after 10 years of misery and of deprivation, of great deception and disappointment, these African Americans, who are now African Canadians, begin to militate and demand freedom, justice, equality, demand the land that they've been promised. And they send a representative named Thomas Peters to London to fight for their rights, to complain directly to the British Parliament because they're not getting any respect by the British in Canada. And what is not yet Canada, but about to become Canada, it's still a British colony. And they sort of win the ears of British abolitionists who decide to use these Nova Scotian blacks as settlers in a community in Sierra Leone. And so a 25-year-old naval lieutenant named John Clarkson sails from England to Nova Scotia to heed the call of these disgruntled Canadian blacks who wish to leave because they're not getting the rights, the privileges, the land, the freedom that they've been promised in Canada. And so they voluntarily embark in 15 vessels on January 15, 1792, and they sail across the Atlantic Ocean from Halifax to found the colony of Freetown in West Africa, in Sierra Leone. I'm sure you've heard of former American slaves forming the colony of Liberia in the early 1800s, and I'm sure you've heard that in the early 1900s, the Jamaican Marcus Garvey was urging a back to Africa migration, which never really took root. He never really persuaded any large number of people of African descent in the Americas to leave the Americas and go back to Africa, although he urged them to. But long before, more than a century before Marcus Garvey was alive, and decades before the Americans formed the colony of Liberia in West Africa with former slaves, the first back to African migration in the history of the world takes place from Canada. January 15th, 1792, when these 1,200 men, women, and children sail in 15 ships from Halifax across the ocean, crossing slave vessels as they sail, running the risk of being captured by pirates in the ocean and re-abducted and resold into slavery. They do see slave vessels as they sail. They do pass them. And yet they sail safely, for the most part, in humane conditions across the ocean to create this colony of Freetown in West Africa, which is to become an experiment, a British experiment to try to populate Africa with civilized, I use between quotes, North American blacks who are to create, ideally, a colony that will export natural resources from Sierra Leone and enrich the British Empire and carry out religious initiatives as well, missionary initiatives as well. That is the purpose of this colony. And it's also to prove that there is usefulness in that black people can be useful to the British Empire without being enslaved, that they can be economically useful by exporting products from Africa and by settling this community that will become a British colony in Sierra Leone. So there is some altruism, but there's also great self-interest in the establishment of this colony in Freetown. And so this story is really largely unknown in Canada and in the States, certainly among ordinary people. And one of the most stunning discoveries was that about a third of the blacks who left Canada to go to create this colony weren't just sailing passively to Africa. They were born in Africa, and they were going back to the country, to the land, to the continent from which they had been stolen as slaves when they were younger. And I had never heard, in all the books about black history that I'd read, in all the conversations around our kitchen table at home, I'd never heard a story of African Americans and African Canadians who managed to get back to Africa in the same lifetime in which they were abducted and taken from Africa. So this was a story I wanted to dramatize, and I wanted to bring it to people's attention and give a face to this sort of intercontinental milk run sort of represented by the movement of these black loyalists. And so I created a woman named Aminata Diallo, who becomes my protagonist. And I wrote the novel as a sort of, not as a sort of, I wrote it on the shoulders of the slave narrative. It acts like a slave narrative. It posits itself as an autobiography of an ex-slave. And Aminata Diallo writes her family story, writes the story of her own life, writes about her abduction in order to draw the reader in. So it's written with the same immediacy in the first person that slave narratives are written. They all begin the same way. This is my name. This is where I was born. This is how I came to lose my parents and how they came to lose me. This is how I was drawn into slavery, and this is how I got out of it. And I'm going to write my story, dear reader, to assert my equality to you, to prove that I'm equal to you in my humanity. That's the purpose of the slave narrative, and that's the purpose with which Aminata begins to write her life story, which becomes this novel, the Book of Negros. And I thought what I'd do, since I'm not a historian, although I've kind of moved into it with my passions as a novelist, and before that a journalist, I thought what I might do to sort of show you how interested I became in this history was to share with you just a few of the visual images that I saw as I spent 5 years in the stacks of the University of Toronto Library and in books from all over the world, and in scholarly articles and in artifacts, show you some of the things I saw, some of the images I came across. It stimulated my imagination and led me through art and through visuals to the story itself. I'll just skip over that one since it's not really germane to the conversation. These are small homes in Mali. But one of the things that I didn't really understand and I had to grapple with as I was writing the novel was to understand and visualize as a novelist with detail how it came to be that African people were abducted from their villages, from wherever they lived, and how they were taken to the sea. Clearly, thousands of Africans were not standing on the coast just waiting to be embarked on slave vessels. So where had they come from and how were they processed? How were they brought from wherever they were living to the sea? And where could I read about this? Where would I get first-person accounts that I could use that might enrich the writing of this novel? And finally, I came across this astounding and disturbing set of diaries by this Scottish physician named Mungo Park. When did he live again? I'm trying to remember. Mungo Park was born in the 1700s, and in 1797, he becomes perhaps the first Westerner, if not the first, one of the very first Westerners to travel deep into the heart of West Africa. And he travels, and he sees in the Niger River, and he travels for months, and I think for more than a year, deep into West Africa. You need to understand, of course, those of you who haven't studied this, that up to this point, Europeans were kept on the coastal regions of Africa. They conducted their slave trading from the coast, and they paid African intermediaries to do their dirty work for them. So Europeans weren't grabbing Africans in the interior of Africa. They were buying them and purchasing them on the coast from African intermediaries. So Mungo Park described these walking villages of attached people, attached by the neck, often attached with wooden yokes, called coffles, C-O-F-F-L-E-S. This was a word he used, and this is a word I came to know. So people were moved as they were attached by the neck, sometimes entire villages of people moving for months overland from the interior of Africa to the sea, where they were sold to slavers and held in slave factories, forts, often dying there in the holds of ships before they even left the coast of Africa, and then finally taken through the Middle Passage. So that was a visual description that I came across for the first time that I'd never seen before and I've rarely seen since, a first-hand description of how these people were taken overland. And the idea that some of them were marched for months led me to Aminata's case. She's abducted as an 11-year-old girl from Mali and is forced to walk for 3 months through 3 revolutions of the moon, through 3 menstrual cycles before she makes it to the coast, where she's sold into a slave vessel that takes her to the Sea Islands just off the coast of South Carolina. And the more I read about slave ship voyages, the more I came to realize that there was no way that I could write this novel without having an uprising, a revolt on mine. It was, of course, needed dramatically. It would be satisfying dramatically. It just had to happen. And there were many, many, many slave revolts on slave ships crossing the ocean, and some of them were led by women. This is a painting by J.M.W. Turner, the British painter, and it's a hideous painting. It's probably hard for you to make out that there are African people who are in the waters there drowning. Their hands are sticking out of the water. And this painting by Turner is called Slave Ship, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. It was painted in 1840, and it represents the story of the Zong. And the Zong, Z-H-O-N-G, was a British slave ship that had been moving from Africa toward the West Indies in 1781. And as this ship approached the Americas, in a storm, the owners of the ship chose to throw overboard 122 sick captives, Africans who were still alive, who were on this slave ship but who were sick. They chose to throw them overboard in order to claim insurance money. And so it was discovered what they'd done, but they were never charged. They were never brought to court. They were never made to pay in any criminal way for this. They failed to collect the insurance money that they hoped to get. But it's a hideous story of abuse of slaves, of African peoples on these slave vessels. And so the story of the Zong inspired Turner to paint this hideous painting, which struck me profoundly and led me to think about a revolt on board of the slave vessel in which Aminata finds herself as a young 11-year-old girl in about 1755. This is the Gullah painter, Jonathan Green. These are works by Jonathan Green. Jonathan Green now lives in Florida. He's one of the best-known African-American contemporary painters, and he paints paintings of Gullah life. And my character comes to live on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, a little island called St. Helena Island, not too far from Hilton Head. And I was interested in creating a sense of community, a sense of black community, a sense of belonging in these places, and to create a girl and a community around her who aren't just victims, who aren't just oppressed, but who carry on with their own economies and assert themselves and are human beings in addition to being captives, in addition to being slaves. And I was quite inspired by this particular painting called Tales by Jonathan Green on the left, which obviously tries to evoke a notion of community, a notion of people sitting around at night or a day talking and entertaining each other with stories. He's quite an astounding painter, and he always uses very vibrant colors The one on the right is another painting which is called Queen. But I looked at many of his works as I was creating this story. And of course, the Gullah story is a fascinating chapter of African-American history, very little known, certainly in Canada. And there's a uniqueness to the story of the Africans who were brought to work and other African-Americans who were born in America who were made to work as slaves on the Sea Islands. And what's unique about their situation is that because of the infestation of mosquitoes, people are dying in great number of malaria on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina. And although it's not yet known that the mosquito is a vector of malaria, it is known that if you happen to be living on these islands in the spring, summer, or early fall, you're likely to die, especially if you're white. And so it so happens that this becomes the only place in the United States where African-American slaves are left in charge of themselves for up to 6 months of the year. For up to 6 months of the year, these plantations are evacuated by their white owners, and African Americans rule themselves in these plantations, which gives rise and allows for the rise of the Gullah culture and the Gullah language, and it becomes a place in which my character settles. And so it's an amazing chapter of African American history. And at nighttime, many people are traveling the rivers, selling things, looking for lovers, looking to sell a pig that they might have grabbed somewhere, looking to make commerce with each other. They're moving around at night, and those ideas and those descriptions animated my own writing of this novel, and that took me to another meditation as well. One of the chief cash crops, really the chief cash crop off the Sea Islands, in South Carolina and Georgia, was indigo. And indigo, in the third quarter of the 1700s, was the most important cash crop to be produced. And indigo, of course, is collected from this tall plant, and then it's processed through several vats. This particular painting is not from the States, but it's from the West Indies. But as the indigo is processed through several vats, this dye is collected in the mud, and the mud is shipped over to England. And of course, indigo is very popular at the time for the deep blue, purplish color that it creates. And it's a very, very popular product. And it's also very dangerous to produce because of the infestation of mosquitoes. Many people are dying as they're working the indigo. And so this is what my character, Aminata, does in addition to being a midwife. This, of course, is the final product. This is what you see indigo becoming, making somebody's dress beautiful in Europe. And during the Revolutionary War, more soldiers died of smallpox than died of wounds inflicted during military battle. And I started to read about how African Americans began to protect themselves against smallpox, and they began to inoculate themselves with these homemade techniques to protect themselves against the ravages of smallpox. So the next time a wave hit a village or a plantation or a city, perhaps these African Americans wouldn't die. So what they do is slice open a bit of arm and take a bit of thread from somebody's clothes, somebody who died of smallpox, insert that thread into the cut, close it up, and if it didn't kill you, it'd protect you against the next smallpox epidemic. And so this was sort of the homemade inoculation that African Americans were using in the Deep South to protect themselves in the mid-1700s against smallpox. My character has to undergo this same inoculation too, which I needed her to do so she wouldn't die, or so it wouldn't be preposterous that she got to live so long. She got to survive these epidemics because she'd been inoculated by a woman who sort of took her under her wing and adopted her sort of as a child. So Aminata, my protagonist, becomes highly literate, and I didn't want her to become literate strictly as a result of the benevolence of some kindly slave owner. I wanted her literacy to have deep roots and to have African roots. And if you were living in West Africa in the mid-1700s and you were about to be abducted, there's only really one way that you might have been exposed in that time to literacy, and that would have been to have one or two parents who were Muslims, who celebrated Islam and who read the Quran. And Arabic was not a language that was spoken in West Africa in the mid-1700s, but it was a language of study among those who were Muslims, and the Islamic faith was growing in various pockets of West Africa in the mid-1700s. So Aminata, in this novel of mine, is exposed to literacy through her father, who reads the Quran at night, and she wants desperately to become literate herself. She wants desperately to know how to read and write in Arabic as her father does. And they talk about Timbuktu, and they talk about Arabic study, but she's abducted before she gets to realize these dreams. And she comes to North America, and she acquires literacy and numeracy. She becomes highly literate and highly skilled with numbers, as some did, and we know this because we've seen slave memoirs written by people who, despite rules against it, learned to read and write very well. Not only does she become literate, but she wants to see maps. And she wants to understand where she comes from, and she feels a sense of shame that she doesn't know where in Africa she comes from. If somebody gave her a boat and said, go, she wouldn't know where to take it. And she feels shame that she doesn't know how to get back to the home from which she was abducted. So she starts asking for maps once she becomes literate. But the maps that she sees are the maps that I started to study in the University of Toronto Library, 18th century, 17th century maps of Africa, which are preposterous. They're maps that are drawn by Europeans who've never seen the inside of Africa, who have no idea what they're doing. And when they come to a piece of Africa that they don't know anything about, they just stick an elephant. As you'll see, if you look toward the middle of West Africa. So elephants become, and other sort of wild animals become the adornments of these European cartographers when they don't really know what to put in the map. And this is what you'll see if you study dozens of maps drawn by Europeans in the 17 or 1800s. I asked myself, when I was writing this novel, well, would it be right for her to have a level of indignation or horror or anger to see her continent, to see her lands represented in this way, not to see any details, but to see elephants for want of towns? I asked myself what her response to this might be, and was I sort of employing a 21st century mentality in writing about an 18th century African woman by giving her a measure of indignation? And I wasn't sure if it made sense to make her angry or not in finding these maps, until I found, while studying these maps, a poem by the famous writer Jonathan Swift, who wrote a poem mocking these maps in 1733. So 1733 was about 15 or 13 years before my character's born. So I figured that if Jonathan Swift could mock and satirize the idiocy of these maps, that my character had a right to feel a measure of anger too. And this is a quote from Jonathan Swift's poem referring to these very maps that he wrote in 1733. So geographers in Afric maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er uninhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns. So this sarcastic reference to these maps gave me literary license to give Aminata a measure of anger herself when she fails to find her continent and her people in these European maps of Africa. This is Sam Francis, and this is a Francis Tavern. Who is Sam Francis, and why is he significant? And why did he sort of... Sam Francis, by the way, is played by Cuba Gooding Jr. in the miniseries that was released earlier this year. Sam Francis was a man who owned this tavern, the Francis Tavern, in the southern tip of Manhattan, which served anybody who came in. He became a very successful tavern owner. He also catered a meeting between George Washington and Sir Guy Carleton when they were arguing about the evacuation of Negroes and other property from New York to Canada. He catered that meeting. And he also hosted a lunch for George Washington when he came to New York to celebrate his victory. So George Washington meets with his generals in the Francis Tavern, which still exists, which is now a museum where you can go get a bite to eat as well in the southern tip of Manhattan. You should go see it the next time you visit Manhattan. The Francis Tavern people, the people who run the museum, claim that Francis was white. I happen to believe he was black. Historians in the States argue vociferously about his racial provenance. But I've met some of his descendants, and they're black, and they insist that he was black. And there's a debate about this. It's quite an interesting debate. But in the novel, I chose to represent him as black. He came from the West Indies as a young man. He had this successful tavern. And he goes on to be George Washington's steward and chief cook when Washington becomes the first president of the United States. Quite an interesting figure. So he figures prominently in the novel as well. This is Wall Street. This is where Wall Street became. If you were an African American in living in New York City during the Revolutionary War, you're not allowed to bury your dead in the churches of New York City. You have to cart your dead north of Wall Street and into the woods. So the urban section of Manhattan is limited to anything that's at Wall Street and further south. And so if you're black and you want to bury your dead, you have to go basically into the forest north of Wall Street, north of the Wall, and bury your dead there. And as some of you know, approximately 20 or 25 years ago, construction workers right around City Hall in southern New York began to uncover bones as they were constructing a major building and found the remains of African peoples who had been buried there. And so there was a long fight to figure out what to do about this. And finally, the African American community in New York insisted that these bones, these burial grounds, sometimes called the African burial grounds, other times called Negro burial grounds, that they be commemorated. So there's now a beautiful memorial right near City Hall. You should see that as well if you go to New York, that commemorates the presence of this African burial ground in the very southern tip of Manhattan. That too inspired a scene in the novel. Oh, this I'd love to share with you. This is a proclamation by John Earl of Dunmore, the Governor General of Virginia, who's a slave owner, by the way, but who's promising freedom, along with others, to any African Americans who will flee slavery and come to serve the British during the war. And he declares in this proclamation, I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. So basically, promising freedom to any African Americans who served the British during the war. So this is one of the two formal proclamations made promising such freedom, and that's why 3,000 blacks come to New York during the war to serve the British. This is a page from the Book of Negros, which I started to study as a result of Professor Hodges' book and several other books on the subject. It's a fascinating, long-forgotten historical document. The Book of Negros is a British ledger kept by the British Navy in 1783, documenting the exodus of 3,000 African Americans from New York to Nova Scotia. It's the first time in American or Canadian history that thousands of black people are publicly documented, named, described, their name, their age, what they looked like, their marital status, who used to own them, how they fled their owners, whom they served during the war, and where they're going. It's an incredibly interesting document if you're interested in genealogy, in black genealogy. The original is housed in the National Archives of the UK. I've been to see it. The Queen asked me about it when we met, actually. And you can also see it in the New York Public Library. You can see it in the Nova Scotia, in the federal government of Canada's National Archives. You can see this document in various places. You can find it online in 5 minutes if you start looking. This is an ad for slaves in Canada. Many Canadians don't even know their own history, that slavery existed in our country, Canada, until 1834. So sometimes I like to show Canadians an ad showing a slave sale in Canada, just so they can see with their own eyes that it was happening in Canada as well as the United States. This is Rose Fortune, sort of a famous African-Canadian woman who was considered to be one of the first, well, really the first black policewoman in Canada, who was also a sort of a self-appointed stevedore, and who worked on the shores of Nova Scotia, Rose Fortune. This is, you don't see very many paintings of African Canadians doing domestic things, domestic ordinary things. And it's rare to find art showing African Canadians sort of just doing normal things. So I love this painting of this black man who's sawing a log in Nova Scotia around 1793. And it too inspired a scene in the novel where this man is set upon by a mob as he's sawing a log, because people are angry to see him taking work from white soldiers, former soldiers who are disbanded, now living in Nova Scotia. Another domestic painting of black life in Nova Scotia in the 1700s. And this is sort of the second last of some art I'll show you. This is just off the coast of Sierra Leone, and it looks a little bit idyllic. Here are the black loyalists coming from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone to found the colony of Freetown. But if you look more carefully, and you have a chance to see this painting up close, you'll see the great misfortune. There's actually a slave vessel on the far left-hand side of the painting, and Africans are being abducted into slavery in the slave vessel at the same time that the black loyalists of Nova Scotia, formerly from New York, are coming to settle a colony in Sierra Leone. So they're actually settling a colony in Sierra Leone alongside a major slaving operation. So not quite the idyllic, peaceful situation that they thought they'd encounter in coming to create their own colony in Sierra Leone. And finally, I love this work of art. This is the British satirist James Gillray. He's considered to be the father of British satire, the father of British caricature. And he painted this caricature in right around the time of the Black Loyalists, right around 1792. And he's mocking the king and queen, King George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte. By the way, some believe that Queen Charlotte had black ancestry, and that's something you'll encounter in various texts as you read about this. There are some who argue that she was black, and she was nicknamed the Black Queen by some at the time. But anyway, this is Queen Charlotte and King George III with their numerous children. And this is a bitter attack on British privilege and on the British monarchy, because Queen Charlotte is urging her children to engage in the sugar boycott and to help the poor black people of the Americas who are working sugar. So she's trying to persuade her daughters to have a sugar boycott and take their tea without sugar. Of course, this is ridiculous because the British Empire is a leading slave trading nation of the world at the time. And the last thing in the world the King of England is going to be proposing is a sugar boycott when this is a nation that profits the most in this time from the institution of slavery. So it's a biting assault on the hypocrisy of the British monarchy, and really quite a hilarious caricature. And it got me thinking about Aminata as she ventures to London to side with the abolitionists during the end of her long journey in life. So those are a few of the works of art that I encountered in trying to summon this novel and trying to bring it to the page. And it was a great honor to do so. And I have found that, indeed, many people who knew nothing of this story, the Black Loyalists, and their migrations all around the world, have come to it as a result of this novel and have started digging in the histories that they didn't know before. So I'm actually quite proud to popularize African American and African Canadian history and to sort of excite people about it. I was very happy to see it turn into a miniseries as well, and that was a fun project to co-write and see filmed in South Africa and in Canada. And I'd like to thank you so much for welcoming me today, and I hope that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit as the evening wears on. I've been asked if I would take questions, and I'm more than welcome to attempt to answer them if you have any. Otherwise, we can always mingle afterwards as well. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Actually, I grew up in Canada, and I never heard any of the issues you brought forth today. And can you tell us a little bit more about how Canadian schools have responded to your work?
How have Canadian schools responded? Well, I'll tell you first, just to entertain you, that when the book came out in the States, it's published by W.W. Norton and Company. Norton decided at the last minute to change the title because they didn't feel that African Americans would welcome the word Negroes in the title. So in the States, it became Someone Knows My Name, which some have likened to watered down rum in relation to the Book of Negros. But that's what happened. I was required to change the title at the 11th hour just as the book was going to print. So it became Someone Knows My Name in the States. But when BET released it as the Book of Negros on television here in the States, my publisher finally relented to my request and agreed to reissue it as the Book of Negros. I guess if BET gave the moral license to embrace the word Negroes in the title, they could too as well. So I'm happy to say that it's now available as the Book of Negros in the States. As for your question, unfortunately, most Canadians don't know much about African American history. They're much happy to talk about slavery in the United States, and they recognize that it existed in Canada. If they do know a little bit about African Canadian history, they've probably heard only about the Underground Railroad. The story of the Black Loyalists, of course, predates the Underground Railroad by decades. Although Professor Hodges posits, and I'll let him talk about this, that the Underground Railroad and the Black Loyalist migration are sort of connected, and this can be considered an early form of the Underground Railroad. I'm not sure about that, but it's a very interesting idea. But very few Canadians had heard this story unless they were descendants of the Black Loyalists who still live in Nova Scotia. So thankfully, the novel has generated so much interest, in Canada that many school boards use it in Nova Scotia, especially, and in Ontario. It's not mandatory reading, but it's used, I'm hearing pretty well daily from some student or teacher in some school writing to ask me questions about it because it's being studied in their classroom. So it's not used uniformly, but it's slowly knocking To Kill a Mockingbird off the curriculum. Hello.
And then a kind of broader question. Is John Clarkson any relationship to Thomas Clarkson?
Yes, he's his brother.
Oh.
Yes, Thomas Clarkson was a famous, as you know, but for the others, famous abolitionist. And John Clarkson is his younger brother, not at all famous, except for the fact that at the age of 25, he's sent by the British to organize this exodus of 1,200 Nova Scotians, black Nova Scotians, from Halifax to Africa.
Well, thank you. You've helped me with my book. My second question is, to what extent did the blowback from the San Domingo uprising reach Nova Scotia or any part of Canada in terms of affecting the lives of Black Canadians there?
I don't know exactly how the uprising affected life in Nova Scotia, but I have heard that it certainly set back efforts to abolish the slave trade in British Parliament. And that was such a long and difficult fight. For 20 years, people were trying to abolish the slave trade in British Parliament. And for 20 years, until they finally succeeded in 1807, they kept failing. And I believe that the uprising was cited as a reason not to abolish the slave trade. But that's a really great question. And I'm afraid that I don't know the answer. I haven't read anything about how that uprising affected African Nova Scotians or how it affected life there. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Is it possible, Graham, that you might know the answer to that?
Well, certainly the United States was very concerned about it. Although John Adams attempted to establish diplomatic relations with Haiti after the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson put a stop to American efforts. That said, I think what's very interesting about Mr. Hill's talk and the migration of Afro-Nova Scotians to Sierra Leone is that they took with them very powerful Republican ideals of governance, ideas that in fact were more radical than those being expressed in the United States at that time. They had a much, much wider sense of suffrage and representation. They wanted votes represented according to every 100 families, which is much, much radical in the United States.
They wanted to govern themselves.
Yeah, they governed themselves. So one of the things that his book, of course, has helped do is to make us understand the importance of independent black governments in the 1790s. And of course, Haiti is always hailed as the first and most important of these. But the black loyalists, having won their freedom in the American Revolution, oftentimes through military service, most frequently in fact, then getting the recognition of the British government, being settled in Nova Scotia, and then creating an independent country, although its foundations were a bit shaky because the British never bothered to inform people in Sierra Leone that they were coming. Nonetheless, this was a black republic and remains that way to the present day. So, I mean, I think what's significant about Mr. Hill's work here is we have to recognize that this was like Haiti. This was a black republic that was born and seized by violence and gaining liberty.
I think I know who might be able to answer your question. I'm going to look into that, and if I can find out how to reach you, I think I know just a person who could answer that question about the effect, of the uprising in Santo Domingo in Nova Scotia. So I'll look. Now I'm quite curious to find out. Just.
I think Laurent DuBois,
Pardon me?
Laurent DuBois, who's a Duke, studied this question.
I see. Yeah. All right. Were there any other questions? Hello. Hi.
Africans.
The Maroons.
That's right. I was wondering if you say something about that.
Sure.
Well, the same thing happened to them.
Yes, the Maroons were from Jamaica, as Professor Moore will tell you, and the first wave of blacks from Nova Scotia who left to go to Sierra Leone left Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1792. The Maroons left in 1808, I believe it was, from Halifax to go to Sierra Leone. The Maroons who came to Halifax had been tricked into coming out of kind of a state of guerrilla warfare, tricked into surrendering from the guerrilla warfare that they'd been conducting. And once they were grabbed, they were sent to Nova Scotia. And of course, they weren't very happy being in Nova Scotia. It wasn't where they wanted to go. And so they didn't stay all that long. They arrived after the black loyalists left. And not too long later, they too were sent to Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, there was such conflict between the African Nova Scotians and the British colonists in Sierra Leone that the British used the Maroons to help quash a bit of a social insurrection, some fighting, a bit of a civil war led by the African Nova Scotians. So the Maroons actually engaged in battle against the African Nova Scotians while they were trying to establish their freedom. So they had a conflictual relationship before finally blending. And of course, there were many societies in Sierra Leone at the time. Not only were there the Maroons and the African Nova Scotians, but there were also peoples from all over Africa who were sort of dumped in Sierra Leone after being liberated by British abolitionists, by the British who were patrolling the coast of Africa, liberating slave vessels. If they found slaves and liberated them, they brought them to Sierra Leone. So you had quite a mixture of people arriving in Sierra Leone at this time. So the Maroons were among them.
I could also add to that as the Reading lecturer Alan Taylor spoke about this a couple of years ago and published in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Internal Enemy, during the War of 1812, approximately 5,000 Afro-Virginians boarded vessels, British vessels that were bombing the Virginia coastline, bombing plantations and making forays into the interior, and they then left with the English for Nova Scotia, about 5,000 of them in 1813, 1814. So we get 1783, then we get another group in the 1790s, we get the influx of recaptured Africans, and then another group of 5,000. We're getting some pretty significant numbers here.
We are. Thank you for your question, Brian. Well, it looks like we've drawn to a close, but I'm happy to chat with you one-on-one outside, and thank you so much for inviting me back to Colgate, and I hope to come back again sometime soon. Thank you.